I jumped on the judge in the courtroom because I didn't like the sentence she gave me. My name is Deborah Redden, and I'm 30 years old. I'd had a few run-ins with the law before and was convicted of domestic violence and breaking and entering. When I appeared in court on January 4th, 2024, I was anxiously awaiting the judge's decision on my sentence. Although my lawyer had pleaded for probation, the judge took my criminal record into account and decided to give me a firm prison sentence, which deeply upset me. Convinced of the injustice of this decision and that it was directed against me, I reacted impulsively. Just as the judge was about to pronounce my sentence, I hurled insults at her before rushing towards her, clearly expressing my intention to cause her harm. 2 other people in the courtroom were injured as a result. As for the judge, she was hospitalized after suffering a blow to the head, although her condition is now stable. This unusual situation in a place that is supposed to be secure raises questions about the effectiveness of the security guards' work. Do you think they failed in their duty?
My friend killed me because I dared to eat the last piece of chicken. My name is Darwin Perez Gonzalez. I was 34 years old and was looking forward to a pleasant evening with friends. On a November evening in 2015, in Houston, Texas, we gathered for a meal and a drink. After finishing preparing the meal and enjoying a few drinks, we sat down to eat. At first, everything was going well. However, the atmosphere changed dramatically when I grabbed the last piece of chicken on the table. This action angered my 38-year-old friend, Reynaldo Cardoso Rivera. From there, the situation quickly deteriorated. Verbal exchanges led to rising tension in the apartment. We then went to the parking lot where an altercation broke out. During this confrontation, Reynaldo, armed with a kitchen knife, stabbed me. Tragically, I died from the injuries sustained in this attack. Reynaldo was quickly arrested and taken into custody following the incident. Considering these circumstances, what sentence do you think he deserves?
This is Grant Solomon. He died on July 20th, 2020 under mysterious circumstances. His dad, Aaron Solomon, who was also his abuser, was the only person who witnessed his death, and he claims that it was a freak accident that took his son's life. But just before he died, Grant was about to expose his father for the years of abuse against him and his little sister Gracie, who has also publicly spoken about what her father has done to her. But just before he could, he was killed while being in the presence of his father for the first time in 2 years. I previously covered Grant's story on here way more in depth, as have many other creators, so please be sure to go and watch those videos if you need more information. But the podcast Cup of Justice also just released an episode mentioning Grant's case. So I urge all of you to please go and listen to this and maybe tag the creators here in the comments to help boost this story. This is all directly supported by Grant's mom and his sister, who have been advocating for him since he's no longer here. It's really important to engage with true crime content that's supported by the families. But the other thing is that Gracie also deserves justice. She was abused by her father, Aaron Solomon, for years, and he still has not been charged for that either. He's currently just walking free. Angie and Gracie are relying on us to keep Grant's story in the public eye. If you're looking for ways that you can help, consider looking in my bio.
Want to give a viewer discretion. This case is really graphic. I'm not going to get too into detail. Regardless, what happened was sad as there was 2 girls, Louisa Jesperson and Maren Yulin. They were very good friends, and they both attended the University of Southeastern Norway. And in 2018 of December, Louisa told Maren she wanted to go to Morocco to go hiking and stuff. But before the trip, Louisa, she had made a Facebook post about wanting to go. And she had said, "Dear friends, I'm going to Morocco in December. Any of you guys who's around by then, or any mountain friends who know something about Mount Toubkal." And they go up the mountain. They eventually ended up stopping at a certain area because they got tired, they wanted to rest, so they put up their tent. And during that time, people say that killers were stalking them and they were just waiting for an opportunity for them to attack, which they did. They go in with a machete. First girl, Louisa, she's beheaded, and then the same thing happened to the other girl. But what made this whole thing fucked up was that one of the guys was recording it.
Bro, stop.
I don't have the video. I did not search it up, bro, so you don't have to worry about that. They put both heads in the tent, and that's it. A week before the murder, they had posted a video on the internet pledging their allegiance to ISIS. And they were saying how they were planning to do a terrorist attack on either security services or foreign tourists around the area.
Bro,
So they were already planning this shit ahead. The crazy part is that they did get arrested. They did get the death penalty acquainted to them, but they have not been executed yet. They're still alive.
Mother of two, Stuart Lubbock, died under mysterious circumstances at the home of celebrity Michael Barrymore. In the early hours of the 31st of March 2001, a 999 call was placed. This alerted emergency services to a body in the pool of TV personality Michael Barrymore. The caller said, "A fella has drowned in the pool." He explained that they had got him out, and he said, "I think the geezer's dead, mate." However, no independent witnesses report seeing the man actually in the pool. An ambulance arrived and found Stuart next to the outdoor swimming pool. Stuart was 31 and a factory worker from Essex. It is reported that some of the eyewitness testimonies contradict each other. On some occasions, witnesses claim that the man was facing up in the pool and others stated he was facing down. Now, the autopsy showed that the 31-year-old had numerous substances in his body as well as alcohol. His body showed signs of severe internal injuries which would indicate SA. It was also reported that he had marks on his body indicating restraint or strangulation. Michael Barrymore was arrested in connection with the death, but he was later released without charge. ITV terminated his contract, but it was later found that his arrest was unlawful. It was ruled that the police had no grounds to arrest him on. Stuart's brother Kevin has expressed suspicions about people who attended the party. He claimed that there has been a wall of silence around his brother's death. More recently, in 2021, a man was arrested on suspicion of murder and indecent assault, but was later released without charge. Let me know what you think in the comments. This case just does not add up to me. Days after this woman vanished, police made two shocking discoveries after residents reported something strange in their apartment. Heather Lacey was a 29-year-old mum living in Deerfield Beach, Florida. It was the 21st of November 2013, and her family reported her being in a downward spiral. She had been using substances and wasn't in a good place mentally. She'd become addicted to taking painkillers after a cesarean section during the birth of one of her children. This then led to her taking other substances and engaging in criminal behaviour. Suddenly, she seemed to just vanish into thin air. Her family reported her missing after being unable to get in contact with her, and years passed by. It wasn't until February 2019 that a horrific discovery was made. Members of the public decided to make a phone call to police. They were living in an apartment in Hollywood in Florida and smelt a foul odour coming from inside one of the properties. The apartment in question was that of 36-year-old Jonathan Escargaza. Police forced entry into the property and found Jonathan deceased. He was found to have been dead for days prior to being discovered. Now, the coroners were actually unable to determine his cause of death. However, that wasn't the last discovery in that property. The landlord was called and he hired a company to remove and dispose of items in there. When they came to remove an upright freezer, they discovered that inside was a mummified body. The body was identified as Heather Lacey. Her death is still unsolved, as is the death of Jonathan. Unfortunately for Heather's family, they've been left with more questions than answers. Are the panicked texts that this woman sent to her friend just before her husband did the unthinkable. Kurt Keithley was 39 years old and he was married to 33-year-old Samantha. It was 2018 and the pair had tied the knot around 6 years prior. They were living in picturesque Lando Lakes in Florida with their blended family. Kirk actually worked as a sheriff's deputy in Hillsborough County, so Samantha should in theory have been safe with him. Instead, her life would be taken in the most horrific way by the man meant to protect her. It was the 23rd of September and the couple had been arguing for hours. Their 14-year-old son was at home at the time and could hear the commotion. There were also 3 other children present. At around 10 to midnight, Samantha sent some text to her friend as follows. Kirk has lost his mind, Kristen. He's literally losing it. He's been harassing me for the last 6 hours and I've asked him repeatedly to just leave me alone because I'm sick. She then texted, I just chucked my ring outside. And that was the last time she would ever speak to her friend. Just after midnight, the police got a frantic phone call. The 14-year-old was on the line stating, oh my God, my stepdad just shot my mum in the head. Please help me. He then went on to tell the dispatcher, "My stepdad and mum have been arguing for a night and she went to a hotel and she came back and I heard them arguing and I heard a gunshot and I walked outside and I saw her." He then said, "She was bloody, I saw her dead." Officers raced to the scene, but they turned up to find 2 people deceased. Keith had shot his wife and then turned the weapon on himself. Although obviously traumatized, thankfully the children were unharmed. Police had never been to the property previously for any disputes.
This one is called the Oakland County Child Killer, and it's still an unsolved mystery. The killer has never been caught. Nobody knows who the killer is. There was a killing spree, 4 kids, ages from 10, 11, and 12. The thing about this, right? They were all found in public areas. They were either shot or strangled to death. And before they died, like autopsy and stuff like that showed that they were like nurtured and cared for before they died. Like they were bathed before they were killed. And like investigators are saying how like could be like some sick parent instinct. Like once that happened, they started creating a bunch of composite sketches what the guys could have looked like. Okay. I do have 2 suspects that could be linked to this.
How did they get the suspects though?
Okay, so one of them, Archibald Edward Sloan. The reason why he was a suspect or whatever, because he was a known child molester, and they had investigated him, and in his car they found like hairs that belonged to 2 of the boys. And there was other hair in the vehicle too that didn't belong to him, so they basically said like, nah, it can't be him.
How does that make sense though?
He could have been like an accomplice. But then there's another one named Chris Bush. Before one of the kids went missing, he was arrested and investigated for CP charges, and then I think a couple years after, he ends up allegedly, but the way the crime scene looked,
It looked like a fake.
when they went in his house to investigate, there was no blood in the scene. His body was fully wrapped around, even his head. And then I have a picture that they took of his room, and there was something in the picture that kind of linked everything together. Right here on the left side, it's a hand drawing, and it's this picture. And they're saying that it could be this kid.
Oh shit!
He's
like screaming type shit, right?
And police reports that picture was never reported or anything. Like nobody knew about it.
They probably didn't even think about it.
Or do you think like they were low key in on it?
This is the last photo that 32-year-old Quaylen Campbell sent to his wife before he was found shot to death. If there's ever a story that needs to go viral, it's this one. At around 1 p.m. on June 2nd of this year, Quaylen texted his wife Talia that he was being held hostage and to call 911. He sent her this photo and his location before he stopped responding. Talia immediately called the police, but the dispatcher seemed to show no sense of urgency, so she drove herself to Quaylen's location, which was about 45 minutes away. When she arrived, the police were still not there, even though it was only a mile from the Colorado Springs Police Department. Once there, she spotted her husband Quaylen slumped over in the driver's seat of his company car, and right next to him was another deceased man with a gun in his lap. Since the police didn't respond to the call, Talia had to be the one to perform CPR on her husband, but he sadly died of a gunshot wound. The Colorado Springs Police Department eventually showed up, but only because of a second phone call from family members reporting the deaths. Authorities have confirmed that the deceased man next to Quaylen was 44-year-old David Carrolls, and the case is being investigated as a murder-suicide. Quaylen didn't know David, but it's believed that David was homeless and that Quaylen was giving him a ride. Once inside the car, David held Quaylen hostage and fatally shot him and then himself. The Colorado Springs Police Department say that they were called to the shooting that day a little after 2 p.m., but phone records show that Talia called 911 nearly an hour earlier at 1:15 p.m. According to attorneys, they are wanting to petition the CSPD to release the audio recordings of the police radio communication to see why exactly nobody responded to the first 911 call. If they had, Quaylen's life could have possibly been saved. Please keep the Campbell family in your thoughts. I've also attached a GoFundMe set up for Quaylen's wife and 2 young kids if you'd like to donate or share.
Mysterious Halloween party disappearance, an abandoned car, and a disturbing twist of events. This is the terrifying case of Karen Swift. Karen was a 44-year-old mum of 4. She was living in Tennessee and vanished from Dyersburg on the 30th of October 2011. She'd attended a Halloween party the night before at a country club. She didn't stay long. Unfortunately, her daughter had been ill at a sleepover, so she had to go and pick her up. She fetched her and then she drove back home. She was actually still living with her husband David despite the pair getting a divorce. 3 weeks earlier, she had filed for the divorce and the pair were actually sleeping in separate rooms. David claimed that he saw her around midnight the previous night and then briefly the next morning. She then seemingly vanished. Worryingly, Karen's car was actually found abandoned not far from her house with her Halloween costume inside. She was reported missing after failing to come home. Tragically, after locals volunteered to help in a search, her body was discovered that December. She was found hidden under leaves near Bledsoe Cemetery, 2 miles from her home. Her cause of death was blunt force trauma to the head. There were many initial theories in the community as to what may have happened. There were rumours that Karen had been involved with a married couple. One of Karen's close friends also told police that Karen had stated to her that she had been involved in something she wasn't proud of. She was also reportedly involved in some kind of argument that night at the Halloween party. Now, David got remarried in 2016 and Karen's case went very quiet. Then, over a decade after Karen's body was discovered, David was arrested and charged with her murder. In July 2023, David had been arrested for stalking his now ex-wife in Jefferson County. He's expected to go on trial for Karen's killing in 2024.
Because fuck you, that's why.
The TikToker I just showed you is allegedly a pedophile and a murderer, and he murdered a toddler just last year. This is Tanner Horner, a former FedEx driver, and on social media, he appeared to be the most normal guy you could imagine. Tanner was always posting photos in goofy hats, cracking little jokes, making meaningless TikToks about his work life at FedEx and his life in general. But in December of 2022, he would commit one of the most atrocious acts you can imagine. On that day, he was out doing deliveries, and he delivered a Christmas present, a package of Barbie dolls, to the home of a 7-year-old girl named Athena Strand. Now, like I said, Athena was only 7 years old on the day that she died, and according to Tanner, on that day, Athena was out in the street playing when he accidentally struck her with his FedEx truck. Now, he went to the girl, he was saying he's sorry, he didn't mean to hurt her, but when she woke up from her state of unconsciousness and told Tanner that she was going to tell her father what had happened, he then proceeded to murder her with his bare hands. Tanner then hid the body in town and went on with his day. Shortly afterwards, though, he was arrested after witnesses placed him at the scene of the crime. And 2 days after he was arrested, he led the authorities right to the location of 7-year-old Athena's body. Now, this story is incredibly disturbing, not only because the TikTok video I showed you that he posted at the very beginning shows him in his FedEx uniform at the FedEx workplace, but Tanner Horner is also allegedly a pedophile. You see, he's being held in prison right now on murder charges, but he's also being held for 4 charges of SA against a child that stem back to 2013. 4 charges. So this guy is obviously a scumbag. I know there's a lot more to the story that we're going to find out about soon, but since there's been no trial and no verdict, the details are still pretty slim. But I will update y'all once we learn more about this horrific crime.
There's been a lot more weird shit going on, even shit going on in the ocean.
With the ocean?
In China and in Asia, right? There's these fish called oarfish. These like 11 feet long ass fish, bro. But they only come out when something terrible is gonna happen.
Oh my gosh.
There's mythology behind them that whenever they see them, they're called the doomsday fish. And they're saying like, yo, they're either running from something or they're trying to warn us. Because they live 1,000 to 2,000 feet below sea level. They came out before in 2011 in Fukushima when they had the nuclear plant like went crazy. They had a tsunami.
Okay.
They had a tsunami and an earthquake. And then in 2019, there was a big ass blackout, and then they had one of the worst earthquakes
ever
in history, bro. And now recently, a lot of like biologists and like divers and shit are seeing more and more
of oarfish?
Oarfish coming about, bro. Like, bro, we're already desensitized to it. Think about it. Me and my brother, right? We were talking about, we're like, yo, they just confirmed.
The story behind this mugshot will disturb you. This is Randy Petersilge, and in 2018, he was arrested for murder. Randy was a career criminal who throughout his life had been in and out of the prison system a number of times. But in 2018, when he was arrested for murder, prison would become his permanent home. But who did Randy kill? Well, we have to go 17 years in the past and go back to the night when 41-year-old Simon Clark, a local father, was murdered. On November 28, 2001, police were called to a home that was under construction where they found the dead body of 41-year-old Simon Clark. At the time, he was found beaten to death with injuries to his chest and head. And shortly after they discovered Simon's body, authorities discovered a baseball bat that they believed was used in the murder. Now, what's crazy looking back at it is that way back in 2001, the authorities believed that Randy Petersilge could have been their guy. He was their lead suspect, but they didn't have enough evidence to arrest him, and so they had to cut him loose. Eventually, though, over 17 years later, the authorities showed up to Randy's front door and took him into custody. As it turns out, after all of those years, a few witnesses had come forward and decided that they wanted to spill the tea on exactly what had happened that night. According to the witnesses, Simon Clark had been murdered over a money dispute. So Simon, on the night of the murder, had gone over to this house that was under construction because his friend had found out that he was paying this contractor that he hired $300,000 for $120,000 worth of work. So Simon, hearing this, told his friend that he'd go over and talk to the contractors, and keep in mind Simon was married with 2 children at the time. But when he showed up, he met Randy, and Randy flew into a rage and beat him to death. And as it turns out, the contractor that was hired to do that work on the home had been defrauding Simon's friend the entire time in order to buy narcotics. Thankfully, though, Randy was finally arrested and put into prison for this murder, where he's now serving a life sentence. And this mugshot has to go down in history as one of the creepiest I've ever seen.
This is the crazy story of where the term Stockholm Syndrome came from. In Stockholm in 1973, an escaped convict walks into a bank and holds 4 bank workers hostage. Escaped convict Jan Erik Olsson also wounds a policeman who responded to a silent alarm, and snipers quickly surround the building. The criminal made several demands, including a car and also the arrival of a fellow convict. The police actually fulfilled his wishes, apart from one. He wanted to leave and take his hostages with him. The 2 criminals and the bank worker remain locked in a vault. Inside the vault, something really weird was happening. The bank workers were forming a really bizarre bond with the captors and actually started fearing the police more than their own abductors. They even stayed loyal when they were being threatened with physical harm. One of the criminals wanted to shoot one of the bank workers in the leg to get a reaction from the police. Upon hearing this, one of the bank workers actually claimed that they thought it was so kind that they only wanted to injure them in the leg. In another bizarre twist, the hostages even offered to act as human shields to prevent their captors getting injured. When police eventually pumped tear gas into the building to force them out, the captors even begged police not to hurt their abductors. Finally, when the criminals were sent back to prison, the hostages even went to visit them.
This woman sobbed in court as she was handed a death sentence for the murder of her 4-year-old son Jacob. On August 27, 2003, Nicole Dyer was heard by a neighbour out in the street screaming that her house was on fire and she couldn't find her son. When emergency services arrived and put out the fire, they found Jacob laying on his bed curled up next to his dead puppy. What looked like a tragic accident soon turned into a murder investigation. During Jacob's autopsy, it was found that despite the house being on fire, there was no soot or smoke in his lungs. He was already dead when the fire was set. Nicole had told police that she'd tried to rescue Jacob from the fire, but the flames were too fierce. But police noted that she had no soot or smoke on her clothes, skin, or in her hair. She'd left the house just after the fire had started. It soon came to light that Jacob was merely an inconvenience to Nicole. She often hired babysitters so she could go out clubbing and drinking. She even went out clubbing on the night of Jacob's funeral. A few of these babysitters recalled to police that when they babysat, Nicole would hand them medication to give to Jacob to make him sleep. Police discovered that this medication was prescribed to Nicole, not Jacob, and it was acetaminophen with codeine, which can cause nausea and drowsiness and shouldn't be given to children under the age of 12. Nicole was basically drugging her son to make him sleep so that she could do whatever she wanted. Had she maybe given him an overdose and tried to cover it up by setting a fire? Unfortunately, Jacob's cause of death couldn't be determined as his body was that badly burnt, but one thing was clear: he was dead before the fire started. Nicole was sentenced to death and her execution date was set for January 10th, 2007, but in 2005, her sentence was actually overturned and she was instead sentenced to life without parole. She still to this day professes her innocence and says that she didn't murder her son.
Remember when you talked about La Blancanieves?
Yeah.
If you want to just give like a brief rundown of like where it was or like what it was.
It was kind of like a Disneyland, but in Mexico. But there was a lot of bad stuff that would happen in that specific spot, and it was all allegedly because it was built on top of a cemetery, like a graveyard. And there was this one specific statue, which is a Snow White statue.
Yep.
Of La Blancanieves, and she's cursed. So warning: if you don't want to see her, you don't have to.
She moves around and stuff. There's like footage of her like blinking. There's been a recent video of a guy who was around that area exploring it, and then he sees La Blancanieves move. Oh, way.
No mames, no te muevas ahí.
Yeah, and they're pretty far, bro.
Is that walking on it by itself?
Yes.
Deja que mi cámara enfoque bien, deja que mi cámara enfoque bien. Deja que mi cámara enfoque bien, güey, eso no es el velador. No digas
Then they run to it.
No
Bro, I don't
digas
know.
mamadas,
Those are
güey.
brave. I would not run to that.
Perdón,
They
perdón.
run to it, bro.
No digas mamadas, güey.
Nah, bro, that's
No,
crazy,
Yus,
bro.
no,
You
no,
see
no,
that, bro? We were just.
This woman's boyfriend found CP images on her phone, and the images were of his own daughter. So meet Ashley Cheatham. She's from Oklahoma, and she was just arrested last week after her boyfriend went through her phone and found one of the most disturbing things you can imagine. So initially, her boyfriend thought that Ashley might be cheating on him or doing something weird on the internet. So he decided to go through her phone and make sure she wasn't messaging other dudes. But when he went through her camera roll, he found disturbing, graphic photos of his own daughter in compromising positions being abused by Ashley. Now, immediately Ashley's boyfriend went into the police department and he was basically begging for a police officer to talk to him immediately so that he could report this behavior to the authorities. And after hearing the story and seeing the evidence, authorities went in immediately to go arrest Ashley. And now she's been charged with a number of felonies, including the essay of a child under the age of 12, the making and distributing of obscene material or CP, and some other drug charges. But this story still gets more disturbing if that's even possible. So while authorities were doing a background check on her after her arrest, they found out that Ashley was in the process of applying to work at a local elementary school. And according to some reports, she actually was posting online looking for churches that needed volunteers or workers to help work with the children. So needless to say, I don't know and I don't want to know exactly what she was planning, but this woman adamantly wanted access to children and she was determined to get that access. Sadly, her boyfriend's 3-year-old daughter was the victim and hopefully the only victim that we're going to find out of Ashley's. But yeah, this once again just goes to show that you cannot trust anybody, really. I mean, she's only 19 years old and she's already engaged herself in the most despicable crime you can possibly commit. So, good luck in prison. Have fun. We won't miss you, Ashley.
Imagine leaving your girlfriend at your house when you leave for work. You come back to a scene straight out of a horror film. Brittany McGlone was a 19-year-old girl from Winsboro in Texas. It was the 4th of May 2007 and police were called to a hideous scene. Brittany had spent that night at her boyfriend's family home. She'd worked an overnight shift at a job at a distribution centre and she then went straight to her boyfriend's family home afterwards. She reportedly got there around 7 in the morning and headed straight for bed. Obviously, leaving her to sleep, her boyfriend's family and her boyfriend left to go to their jobs that day. When they returned, they could never have imagined finding what they did. Brittany had been brutally killed. When officers turned up, they were able to determine that Brittany had been assaulted and beaten. Investigators on the case were able to determine that she had been attacked sometime between 8:30 a.m. and 3:30 p.m. Her cause of death was trauma to the head, and interestingly, her underwear was missing. Now, Brittany's boyfriend was an obvious suspect, but he was actually cleared. Him and his family all had solid alibis, and this was confirmed by CCTV footage. Absolutely none of them were at the house at the time that she was murdered. The family were also then able to shed light on a potential suspect. Chad Carr was dating Brittany's boyfriend's sister, Velva, and he obviously knew the property and he actually had a criminal record. Worryingly, he had prior convictions for SA and assault with a deadly weapon. For Brittany's family, the investigation was incredibly frustrating. Many feel like the crime scene may have actually been contaminated by the investigators. It was actually 2021 when a new investigator took over the case and properly looked into Chad. A pair of women's underwear was found at Chad's property, and this was the same size that Brittany would have wore. Velva, the previous girlfriend of Chad, also agreed to then speak to police about the case. She told officers that Chad had acted suspiciously the day that Brittany was found. Chad also potentially had a motive as he had some resentment towards Brittany. He apparently didn't like the fact that she was allowed to stay in the family home and he wasn't. Investigators then asked Chad to take a lie detector test, which he did, and he failed. Now, obviously, these aren't always accurate, but his alibi also had holes. Chad was finally arrested and charged with Brittany's killing. However, frustratingly, there was not enough probable cause to move forward with the charges. Tragically, Brittany's case remains unsolved. Family of this missing girl found out via the media that she'd been murdered, butchered, and sold as kebab meat. This case will put you off ever eating a kebab again. Charlene Downs disappeared aged just 14 years old in November 2003. She was living in Blackpool, UK, and was last seen in an area containing many kebab shops and takeaways. While out with her friends one night, Charlene bumped into her mum. Her mum said that Charlene needed to be home by 10 p.m. that night, which was quite typical for Charlene. Tragically, this would be the last time that her mum would ever see Charlene alive. When Charlene didn't turn up by 10 p.m, her dad went out on his bike looking for her for around half an hour. When he couldn't find her, he just presumed that she'd stayed over at her friend's house and went home and went to sleep. When she still didn't arrive the next morning, her parents started to get worried and they called police. Police, however, said that they could not report this as a missing person until she'd been missing for 48 hours. Eventually, police did start to look for her, but they said that they presumed she was a runaway. The case went cold until 3 years later. Charlene's family were called into a police station. There was news of 2 men who had been arrested, linked with a local takeaway called Funny Boys. They were arrested on suspicion of murder and disposal of Charlene. This is when the family found out some shocking news via the media about what had happened to Charlene. An article published stated that she had been grinded up and sold as kebab meat. One of the brothers of the men who had been arrested had heard them bragging about doing this. Now, Charlene's disappearance actually unearthed the fact that these takeaways were being used as a front for P rings, where men were luring teenagers in with food and alcohol in exchange for things I cannot repeat on this app. When the case against these 2 men went to trial, the jury failed to reach a verdict. The case was then thrown out of court due to apparent lack of physical evidence. One of the reasons for this is how well Charlene's body had obviously been disposed of. Both men who had been charged were given a £250,000 compensation for being falsely trialled. Around a week after the trial, Charlene's mum was actually arrested for stabbing her husband. He declined to press charges, saying that he knew she had been stressed. Members of the family were also charged with racially aggravated assault against the brother of the man who'd been charged with murder, and also punching the man who'd been charged with helping dispose of her body. In August 2017, police arrested a 51-year-old man who lived in Blackpool at the time of Charlene's disappearance. This was on suspicion of murdering her, however, he was released just 2 days later. We still have no justice for Charlene, and nobody is behind bars for her killing.
This pedophile and rapist has never been caught. And over the years from 1996 up through 2012, he assaulted over 35 different women. This is the teardrop rapist, and he's an infamous criminal in the Los Angeles area. So there have been a lot of composite sketches made of this guy over the years, and he still has never been caught, even though they have DNA proof. His pattern of crime and his MO is that he usually finds women who are walking alone, he forces them into a secluded area with a knife or a gun, and then he assaults them. Like I said before, the first known attack was in April of 1996, and the latest was in 2012. And while he usually targets adults who aren't minors, in 2011 he targeted a 15-year-old girl. And everybody always reports the same thing. He looks the exact same, he behaves the same way, his voice sounds the same, and he has those 2 teardrop tattoos. So if you're in the Los Angeles area, be sure to look out for a guy who looks like this. This story does have a particularly sad twist though. In 1999, this man, Luis Vargas, was actually sentenced for these crimes. He was sentenced to serve 55 years in prison, and the only evidence that they had was eyewitness testimony. They claimed that they had found the teardrop rapist and that it was him. But in 2015, after he'd been in prison for 16 years, he was exonerated through DNA evidence. Yes, Luis was not the man, and he was wrongfully convicted and held in prison for over a decade, almost 2 decades. And even though that's good news for Luis, that still means that the teardrop rapist is out there somewhere. So keep this in mind. He reportedly weighs about 130 to 170 pounds. He's somewhere from 5'2" to 5'6" inches tall. He's a Hispanic male with brown hair. At around this time in his life, he'd be somewhere from 40 to 55 years old. He preys on women who are on their way to work or school. He strikes between 5 and 8 a.m. in the morning. He always uses some sort of a weapon, and he usually asks his victims for directions before leading them to a secluded area under the threat of hurting them and then assaulting them. So yeah, they'll hopefully get some sort of a break in this case at some point since they have DNA, but I don't know, it's been 20 years since this really started and there's still no real leads.
Imagine inviting your 13-year-old great-grandson into your house only to be stabbed in the back, literally. That's what happened to Antonio Barbeau's great-grandmother. It was 2012 in Sheboygan Falls in Wisconsin, and Barbara Olson, 78, came out to her garage to find her great-grandson Antonio standing there with his friend Nathan. She invited the boys inside, thinking that they'd just come to visit. She had absolutely no idea that they were armed with a hatchet and a hammer. Once inside, when Barbara's back was turned, her great-grandson Antonio struck her in the back of the head with the hatchet. She fell to the floor and Antonio ran to the bathroom, apparently feeling sick. When he came back out, he saw his friend Nathan strike Barbara twice with the hammer. Barbara was literally begging for her life and she was holding up her hands to try and defend herself. But they didn't stop. Both boys then took it in turns with the hatchet and the hammer, striking 27 times until Barbara was dead. They then took a watch, some jewellery and $150 and then tried to drag Barbara's body through the garage and into the car, but it proved more difficult than they thought, so they abandoned that plan and just left her there in the doorway. They drove Barbara's car to a bowling alley car park and they left some jewellery in the car along with the keys in the hopes that someone would steal it and incriminate themselves in Barbara's murder. But being 13, these boys hadn't really thought past the actual murder. They attempted to wipe some of their fingerprints off the car, but they left the weapons in the boot, covered in their prints and Barbara's blood. The next day, Barbara's daughter went to visit and found her mother's body in a pool of blood. 12 hours later, both boys were arrested. According to Antonio, they both had planned to rob and attack his great-grandmother, and he said that both him and Nathan had taken turns with the hammer and the hatchet. But according to Nathan, it was all Antonio's idea. He did admit to hitting Barbara twice with the hammer while she was still alive, but pleaded not guilty. Photos of Barbara's body were shown in court. She had deep cuts to her face, head, arms and hands, and it was evident that both boys had taken part in the murder. Nathan was found guilty of first-degree intentional homicide, and he was sentenced to life with a minimum of 30 years. Antonio pleaded no contest to first-degree intentional homicide, and he was sentenced to life in prison with a minimum of 36 years, meaning he'll be 50 when he has a chance at being released.
This is the worst thing a cartel has ever done to someone, and whatever you do, don't look up the video. This video was released in late 2018 to early 2019, and it depicts the horrific torture of Leosa Maiz, who is on your screen right now. The video went viral on multiple social media platforms, and when the video opens up, Leosa is squatting on the ground surrounded by several men. It's immediately clear that he has been beaten up before the recording began. Then men start telling Leosa to open his mouth, which he does. Then one of the men grabs his tongue and pulls it so it's exposed and stretched out of his mouth. As the man is holding the tongue, one of the other men grabs a machete and starts slicing off Leosa's tongue. And as this is happening, Leosa is screaming in pain. You see his mouth filling up with blood. They then complete the job and sever his tongue, and a huge amount of blood spills out of Leosa's mouth and covers his chest. At this point, the men make Leosa put the severed tongue back into his mouth. Blood continues to flow, and the look on his face is just haunting. You can see fear cemented on his face and the terror in his eyes. But they weren't done there. They then make him place his hand on a rock, and then the man with the machete starts hacking away at Leosa's fingers. The screams at this point can only be described as haunting. After multiple machete hacks, Leosa's fingers are completely mangled, though they are still attached by shreds of skin. The man with the machete then completes the job and slices off Leosa's fingers. He then does the same with his thumb, hacking and slicing away until the thumb has been removed. And that is where the video ends, but it's not where the torture ends. Off camera, they remove Leosa's entire left hand, and much worse, they completely blind him by gouging out his eyes. And unlike the other cartel videos I cover, this wasn't a prolonged torture session followed by an execution. They actually let Leosa live, essentially serving as a warning to other potential deserters. This case is just awful. Obviously, what they subjected Leosa to was extremely cruel and just downright evil. But what really bothers me is what they subjected him to that day, he has to live with for the rest of his life. Just think about it. He can never see again, and the last thing he did see was what they did to him. He barely has the use of his hands, and communication for him at this point will be extremely difficult. He essentially lost his independence and the ability to earn money for his family. When I see things like this and read about it, I always try and put myself in that person's position. What would I do? How would I feel? And honestly, I wouldn't want to be here anymore. It's just an extremely horrific case, especially knowing how he has to live the rest of his life. There's a news report in Spanish on YouTube covering this case, and you can see how Leosa is now, what his living conditions are like, and you can also see his wife and kid. This case really got to me, and whatever you do, don't search for the video.
You will not believe this insane plot twist. In 2008, Carolyn Watson and Julian Butchwold were a young religious couple. They were living in Melbourne, Australia, and had been together around 2 years. Julian was driving the pair to a picnic date in the car, but he actually stopped the car suddenly, noticing an animal on the side of the road. Suddenly, something horrific happened. Carolyn's vision went completely black after being blindfolded by a terrifying masked man. All she could work out was she was being stripped off and thrown into a vehicle. The car finally stopped and she took her blindfold off, and she was really relieved to see that her boyfriend was by her side. He'd also been stripped off and the couple were completely in the middle of nowhere. The pair managed to untie themselves, but were having to just wander around aimlessly for a week, trying to find safety. Meanwhile, police were desperately searching for the couple. Family and friends were really concerned, and they knew how out of character this was for the pair to go missing. They sent out air and water search teams, but just couldn't locate the couple. As the missing pair were very religious, they'd actually vowed to be celibate until marriage, but Julian started to suggest that it might be a good idea to break this celibacy in order to keep them warm. Finally, a local farmer found the couple and alerted police. However, they quickly found that the story didn't really add up. Julian soon confessed to police that he'd actually made the whole thing up and he'd staged the kidnapping. His motive was purely to try and get his girlfriend to break their vow of celibacy.
Let's talk about a doctor that killed 250 patients. They called him Dr. Death. He's now recognized as one of the most notorious serial killers in modern history. His real name was Harold Shipman, but media liked to call him Dr. Death. You'll see why in a bit. Harold was born in January 1946 in Nottingham, England. It was said in his younger years he exceeded in sports and did really well in school. It was also said that he was really close with his mother, but unfortunately she would end up passing of lung cancer when he was only 17. Some believe that her death sparked something within Harold. Harold would watch while the nurses gave his mother morphine. He loved watching the pain slowly go away. You might think, oh, that's so sweet, he doesn't want his mom in pain. But that's not what was happening. He was fascinated by morphine. So Harold was feeling inspired. So as he grew older, he went to the University of Leeds to study medicine. Well, obviously, he eventually graduated, and that's when he started working in different surgeries. He worked in several different surgeries until he opened his own in 1993. And this is where it all began. There isn't really a timeline on his killings, but he was killing a lot of people, forging documents so it wouldn't seem suspicious. Also, he had a wife and 4 kids at this point while he was doing this. And his wife was probably like, oh my god, my husband's a doctor. Little did she know, he was killing people. He did this from 1993 to 1998. That is a good amount of years not getting caught. But thankfully, eventually people started getting suspicious. A few surgeries around had actually mentioned him to the police, alongside a few funeral homes. So everyone's finding Harold over here a little suspicious. A taxi driver would actually end up going to the police about Harold because he claimed that he had taken several healthy older women to his clinic and they would end up dying. Even though several people had gone to the police about Harold, nothing was done. That's until he messed with the wrong victim and the wrong family. So the final victim that he killed was named Kathleen, and she was really healthy before she walked into his surgery. Kathleen's daughter was already very suspicious when she died, but it really rose when she realized that Harold was on her will. Her will had announced that £300,000 was to go to Harold, her doctor. Real smooth, Harold. So Kathleen's daughter went to the police thinking that Harold had forged the will, but nothing else. When they did Kathleen's autopsy, they actually found traces of a type of heroin used to help patients with terminal cancer. Kathleen did not have terminal cancer. So they question Harold, and do you know what he says? This man over here is like, oh, that's because she was an addict. She was a heroin addict. He then pulled out his doctor notes that he had written in her file that stated that she was an addict. And that was a dumb mistake. The police were able to trace when he wrote these notes on his computer, and they found that he had written it after Kathleen had already passed, so you messed up there, Harold. If he had written these notes at the right time, he could have got away with it. Because the coroner did say that the amount of drugs in Kathleen's system was consistent with drug addict overdoses, but it's a good thing he messed up. Because police did some digging after this one lie, and oh my, did they discover a pile more. Harold obviously got arrested at this point, and they discovered 15 more patients that he had killed the exact same way. Police found out that Harold was changing his patients' medical history files. He was changing the medical history to say that the patients were really ill, so then when they died, it wasn't suspicious. That's also how he was able to get away with it for so long, because no one could say anything. It was in their file. Unfortunately, the police could only charge him with the 15 murders they could prove, but based on all the research that the police did, they think that the number is more around 250. 250 people. Safe to say, Harold will not be a doctor again. He obviously got life in prison, but he actually ended up ending his own life in 2004. And that's the story of Dr. Death. I completely forgot to do the bottom lashes. Whoops. Stick around for more daily true crime, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Bye-bye!
Born addicted to crack cocaine, little Elisa Izquierdo didn't stand a chance with a mother like hers. Elisa was born in 1989 in Brooklyn, New York, to parents Awilda Lopez and Gustavo Izquierdo. Throughout her pregnancy with Elisa, Awilda was abusing crack cocaine, meaning when Elisa was born, she actually had to be weaned off the drugs as she was addicted. Gustavo ended his relationship with Awilda when he realised what she was doing, and he vowed to get custody of Elisa. She actually had 2 children from a previous relationship that she'd lost custody of due to her drug abuse, and they were being raised by family members. When Elisa was born, Gustavo actually managed to win custody, and his world revolved around his daughter. He started taking parenting classes, and he enrolled Elisa in a preschool in 1990. Unfortunately, his health started to decline and he could no longer afford the tuition fees, but she was a promising student, and the principal of the school decided to introduce her to one of the patrons of the school. This was Prince Michael of Greece, and he actually offered to pay for Elisa's tuition fees right up until 12th grade. During her first year of preschool, it came to Gustavo's attention that Awilda had actually beaten her addiction, secured permanent accommodation, got married and become pregnant with her 4th child. She'd also regained custody of her 2 older children. When Elisa was just 2, Awilda applied for visitation rights, and she won, meaning that Elisa would go and stay with her unsupervised every other weekend. Shortly after these visits started, Gustavo and also teachers at Elisa's school started to notice bruises. She also began bedwetting and started having regular nightmares. She also told her father at one point that her mother had beaten her and locked her in a closet. Gustavo tried to get Awilda's visitation rights revoked, but it was denied, saying that as long as she didn't beat her daughter, the visitation could continue. In 1993, Gustavo decided to come up with a plan to get Elisa away from her mother permanently. He was from Cuba and still had family there, so he decided to buy tickets for him and Elisa and take her where her mother couldn't hurt her anymore. The tickets were booked for May 26, 1994, but shortly before that, Gustavo started to experience breathing difficulties. He was admitted to hospital and diagnosed with lung cancer. He then sadly died on the exact day he planned to take Elisa to Cuba. On hearing about Gustavo's death, Awilda decided to apply for full custody of her daughter. Due to the previous abuse of Elisa, there were multiple objections to the court from Gustavo's family and also Prince Michael of Greece. Despite that, Awilda was awarded full custody of Elisa. Now that she had full custody of her daughter, the abuse of Elisa escalated really quickly. Awilda took her out of her private school and enrolled her in a public school. The school's principal quickly observed that Elisa, now aged 5, was emotionally disturbed, withdrawn, and was having regular toileting accidents at school. The principal and Elisa's teachers also noted multiple bruises, and Elisa had started tearing out chunks of her own hair. On March 20th, 1994, Elisa was admitted to hospital with a broken shoulder. This injury was actually found to be 3 days old. Elisa's teachers contacted social services to say that they thought she was being abused, but this was rejected due to lack of evidence. And in December that year, Awilda actually withdrew Elisa from school permanently. She'd also started using crack cocaine again. With Elisa now permanently at home with her mother, the abuse escalated even more. She was locked in her room for most of the day, was not allowed to socialise with her siblings, and was forced to use a chamber pot kept in her bedroom. She was actually forced to eat and drink the contents of her chamber pot. She was regularly kicked, punched, burnt, and Awilda would hold her upside down and mop the floor with her face and hair. She was hung from a curtain rod for Awilda's entertainment, and she had a heavy chest of drawers dropped on her toes and fingers. She was also sexually abused quite regularly. On November 15th, 1995, Elisa was beaten so badly by her mother that she lost consciousness. Awilda had slammed her head into a concrete wall so hard that she dropped to the floor, and it caused a brain hemorrhage. Elisa lay in the house, lifeless, for 2 whole days. Awilda actually contacted her sister at one point and said that she was laid on the floor with fluid leaking from her nose and mouth. This was found later to be brain fluid. Her sister urged her to call an ambulance, and she said she would the next morning. The next day, a neighbour came round, and Awilda made no attempts to hide Elisa's body. She was laid there on the floor, and the neighbour immediately called an ambulance. Elisa was pronounced dead, and an autopsy showed a catalogue of injuries. She had broken fingers, broken toes, damage to her internal organs, evidence of sexual abuse, and a massive brain injury. Elisa's funeral was held on November 29th, 1995, and there were around 300 people in attendance. Awilda Lopez pleaded guilty to second-degree murder and was given a term of 15 years to life. She's been denied parole a number of times, the latest being in 2022.
This little girl was kidnapped in 2018 and has just been found. On the 25th of October 2018, 4-year-old Aranza Lopez was on a supervised visit with her biological mum. Her mum, Esmeralda, was being investigated over abuse allegations, so Aranza was actually in foster care at the time. It was arranged that the pair would have a supervised visit at a Washington shopping centre. However, during the visit, Esmeralda requested to take Aranza to the toilets and used the opportunity to snatch the little girl in a stolen vehicle. The FBI were notified, and a huge search for Aranza, and even advertised a $10,000 reward. It wasn't until a year later that Esmeralda was found and arrested, but there was still no sign of the little girl. That was until last month. She was recovered by Mexican authorities in February in western Mexico. In 2021, Esmeralda was actually extradited back to Washington state and pled guilty to second-degree kidnapping and robbery. She was sentenced to 20 months in prison.
I'm going to warn everybody right now, the case that we're about to cover is easily one of the most disturbing true crime stories I've ever heard in my life, so viewer discretion is really advised for this one. This is Kevin Davis. He was 18 years old back in 2014 when this horrific event took place. Kevin lived here in Corpus Christi, Texas, and shared an apartment with his mother, Kimberly, and his sister, Destiny. On May 26, 2014, Kevin snapped. He had been having homicidal thoughts for a long time, but on that particular day, he decided to bring his dreams and his fantasies into reality. On that morning, Kevin told his mother, Kimberly, that he wanted to unalive himself, and she told him that she couldn't stop him if he wanted to. After hearing this unexpected response from his mother, Kevin went into a rage. He grabbed a cord and attempted to strangle his mother on the couch where she was sitting. But his mom, Kimberly, managed to fight him off, and in a panic, Kevin went into the other room and grabbed a hammer. Now, this is where it gets really disturbing, so if you're still here with me and you have a weak stomach, don't keep listening. Kevin then bashed his own mother's skull in with the hammer, hitting her at least 20 times, and he then grabbed a knife from the kitchen and inserted the knife into the head wound. At that point, Kimberly's head was opened up, she had a massive head wound, and her brain was exposed. And Kevin stuck his hand into his own mother's head and played with her brains. He later told detectives that it felt like putty. Now, after his mother was dead, Kevin dragged her corpse into another room and her, which is unbelievably shocking and disgusting. After all this was said and done, he went to a neighbor's house, told them to call 911, told them that he had just murdered someone, and he was arrested without incident. When Kevin ultimately arrived at the police station, he was brutally honest with investigators about his crimes. I listened to the entire interrogation, and I cannot unhear some of the things that he told investigators. It's vile and shocking. But at one point, he smiles at the investigators with a little grin and says, "Yes, I guess I lost my..." to a corpse. After his trial, he was handed down a sentence of life in prison. He's still alive. He's still in Texas right now. And he even admitted to investigators that if he was given the chance, if he were out on the street again, he would kill again. I'm sorry to have to fill your guys' minds with this stuff, but this is a truly disturbing case that I can't stop thinking about because of how horrific it is. And yeah, I cannot believe that this happened.
This is one of the most disgusting and evil cases I've heard of recently. On the 7th of December 2017, teacher Thelma Boinville was desperately trying to make some extra money. She was doing a cleaning job to earn extra money for her family, and the job suited her as her 8-year-old could come along and play while she worked. This was really handy as it meant she didn't have to fork out for childcare. She set out cleaning some holiday homes on the day in question, and her daughter waited in the car. The spot was a lovely scenic place called Kelky Beach. However, instead of walking in on a normal holiday rental to clean, she walked into a nightmare. Stephen Brown and his girlfriend Hayley Dangerand were in the middle of robbing the place. They were scouring through drawers and wardrobes, hunting for valuables to steal. With Thelma walking in, their plan had been foiled. They decided they needed to dispose of their only witness. The evil pair tied up the mother, whose daughter waited unsuspectingly in the car outside. They used a machete, a knife, and a hammer to murder the innocent woman. But the horror was far from over. They exited the holiday home and came across Thelma's young daughter waiting in the car. They callously told the young girl, "We killed your mum," and then bound her up and gagged her. Sickeningly, they then took the 8-year-old into the home where they'd killed her mum and left her there tied up. The 2 Australian tourists who were renting the holiday home then came back and found the crime scene. The 2 killers were tracked down hours later in Thelma's car, which they'd stolen and driven off in. Hayley was actually wearing her victim's earrings at the time. They actually begged for the officers to just shoot them and end their lives, but they wouldn't get away that easily. Thelma's husband, Kevin, wasn't actually allowed to see his wife's body due to the extent of her injuries. The autopsy revealed that she'd fought for her life, with many defensive wounds indicating a struggle. Since the murder, Stephen and Hayley have both tried to blame each other. Stephen was found guilty of second-degree murder and apparently showed no emotion as the verdict was read out. Hayley is currently awaiting trial. Shocking case of the Philpotts. On the 11th of May 2012, 6 children were in bed asleep when a huge fire broke out of their home. As smoke roared through the building, Mairead Philpott, the children's mother, called the emergency services. Their dad, Mick Philpott, was reportedly making heroic attempts to try and save them. However, 5 children unfortunately died in the fire, and the eldest actually passed away in hospital later on. At first, this appeared to be a tragic accident, but the truth was soon revealed. The fire had been started intentionally with petrol underneath the letterbox. When word got out about who the children's father was, many people were already familiar with him. Mick Philpott was notorious for being outspoken and provocative and had appeared on the Jeremy Kyle show. He claimed to have had 2 wives and seemed to be really proud of this. He also had a horrible history of abusive behaviour towards women. He had been convicted for attacking 2 women with a knife and headbutting a female colleague. A press conference was held about the tragedy that had unfolded. Reporters really expected at this point for the Philpotts to come out and appeal to anyone who had any information about the fire. What the Philpotts actually did was just kind of came out and started thanking people. They didn't ask for any help with any information about the case at all. The only thing Mick asked for is to be left alone. If this genuinely had nothing to do with the parents, you would think that they would come out and be desperate for more information. Neighbours from across the road actually went to the police and told them that they had seen Mick during the fire. He was outside pretending to cough, not actually going in trying to help rescue his children. Police were now suspicious enough to try and set a trap for the Philpotts. They kept them in a hotel room and actually bugged the room. The recording reveals Mick quizzing his wife about how convincing she'd been in her police interview. Locals had also spotted the couple in a pub doing karaoke, dancing and drinking shots. Incredibly strange behaviour for two people who just lost their children. It also came out that Mick was reportedly flirting with nurses at the hospital where his son was on a life support machine. The true story of what actually happened was all about Mick Philpott getting revenge on his ex. In early 2012, one of his wives had left him. She walked out with 5 of their children and Mick just could not take this rejection. He wanted to do something to get her back and wanted custody of his 5 children with her. He set the fire up to frame the ex to make it look like she'd done it. He wanted to be the heroic dad to save all his children and for his ex to go to prison for it. Mick got life in prison for this. Mariad got 17 years and is now released. This case made me terrified to go to the cinema. This is the case of the horror in Screen 9. James Holmes was raised in California. His mum was a nurse and his dad was a scientist. From a young age, he was experiencing night terrors and allegedly actually tried to take his own life when he was just 11 years old. He was apparently obsessed with guns and weapons and had dreamed of becoming a mass murderer. Between May and July 2012, he legally bought 4 guns. Background checks were conducted and he was allowed the weapons. He also bought spike strips, which, if you don't know, pop the tyres of cars if they chase after you. On July the 19th, just hours before tragedy would unfold, James mailed his notebook to his psychiatrist. Inside the notebook, James detailed his plans to kill. The notebook was actually discovered later on undelivered. Just prior to entering a cinema in Aurora, James rang a crisis line to tell them about his plans to kill. However, the call was disconnected after just 9 seconds. At the midnight showing of The Dark Knight Rises, CCTV captures James walking into the cinema. He walks into Screen 9, props open the door and then walks back out again. Shockingly, he goes to his car and gets guns out and gas canisters. He re-entered the screen at about 12:38 PM and set off 2 gas canisters. When he entered Screen 9 again, he immediately opens fire on the audience, instantly killing 10 people. 2 others later died in hospital from their injuries. An additional 70 people were injured. This was an absolutely packed out cinema. James also shot at people as they scrambled to exit the screen. His youngest victim was a 6-year-old girl. Witnesses said this all unfolded as there was actually a gunfight on the screen, and initially they all thought it was special effects and just part of the film. Police were actually on the scene very quickly after the first 911 call. James surrendered to the police and was arrested in the car park. He was apparently very calm when he was arrested and told police that he had booby-trapped his apartment. When police investigated his apartment, this was found out to be true. He was sentenced to 12 consecutive life sentences.